You can't separate the domestic from the international. You could, I suppose, fund the military-industrial complex and help the people, but I believe the goal of the ruling class is to immiserate the people, to lower our standard of living, to keep us in a state of precarity. And what better way to do that than to use our resources for these foreign adventures and attempts at domination that, for them, kill two birds with one stone, keeps the US on top and keeps the people down.
Hello, and welcome to the first ever Global Majority for Peace pod. I'm Ileana Chan, and my co-host is Fiona Edwards. This podcast is brought to you every fortnight, where we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement against the US-led war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. Thank you for tuning in today. If you like what you hear, please do subscribe to this channel so you receive a notification when we release new episodes. And if you appreciate our work, you can support us by becoming a member of Empire Watch on Patreon. The links are below in the description. Your support is vital to build this movement. Hi, and welcome, Margaret Kimberley, to our first ever podcast for Global Majority for Peace. It's absolutely wonderful to have you here. Margaret Kimberley is on the coordinating committee of the Black Alliance for Peace and is an executive editor of the Black Agenda Report. She has briefed the United Nations Security Council on the war in Ukraine and is the author of the book Prejudicial Black America and the Presidents. Margaret, we are so honored to have you on this show.
Well, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be the first. It makes me feel very special. Thank you so much for inviting me.
We're so delighted that you're here, and hot on the heels actually of your recent briefing to the United Nations Security Council on the urgency of achieving peace in Ukraine. And unfortunately, we're in a situation where the United States and NATO are escalating this proxy war in Ukraine in order to, quote, weaken Russia. What I wanted to ask you is, what does the US hope to gain from this? And exactly how dangerous is this situation for humanity that we're currently in your opinion?
Well, the only thing the U.S. has succeeded in getting was severing ties between Europe and Russia. And European nations, being good little vassals, have gone along with it. From the moment it happened, I believe that the U.S. blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, which provided gas from Russia to Germany. It mysteriously blew up in 2022. Last year, in 2023, investigative reporter Seymour Hersh, in a 5,000-word article, detailed his evidence showing that the U.S. had done this, which wasn't hard to believe. The only thing I find interesting is the fact that this story was buried. Seymour Hersh is a Pulitzer Prize winner, former New York Times correspondent, has all the credentials that usually give someone credibility, but this was an inconvenient story, and it was, for the most part, buried. And then they came up with several scenarios of mysterious Ukrainians who had the means to blow up these pipelines. But that's been successful for the US. And of course, that was one of the goal of pulling Ukraine away from Russia, was to force Europeans to buy liquefied natural gas, fracked gas, from the US. And they succeeded in doing that. Otherwise, they thought sanctions against Russia would harm that economy. Biden once said they would turn the ruble to rubble. No such thing has happened. It's damaged the rest of the world, but not Russia. They couldn't keep Russian gas and oil off of world markets. So Russia had this, it was a setback, but their economy is doing fine. The US Secretary of Defense, in a moment of candor, said the goal was to weaken Russia. Russia isn't weaker. There were some who wanted regime change. They wanted Vladimir Putin out of power. He's very securely in power. They wanted to weaken links between Russia and China. Their connection only grows stronger. Xi Jinping said they were better than allies. I don't know what better than an ally is, but it's an indication of how strong the link is between those two countries. So you see nothing but failure. They've harmed Ukraine. Let's talk about the damage done to Ukraine. You have thousands of people dead. It's lost approximately 20% of its territory to Russia. The Ukrainians are being press ganged. There are tons of videos of people literally being dragged off the street. The average age of their army is like 40 years old, which tells you how many young men have been killed. Their economy is supported entirely by the United States. So Ukraine has suffered. So you have this fantasy, they call it primacy, where the US has hegemony and basically controls the world economically, militarily, politically, and none of those things have happened. You've had economic disruption, death of thousands of people. So the US has failed in this effort, but only seems to double down on the failure.
Yeah, I think a lot of us in the West find the overwhelming, I don't know how to even describe it, destruction of the US empire pretty unsolvable. But I am going to sort of put that question to you. Do you see an alternative to this US-NATO escalation? I mean, what would actually be a realistic pathway to peace?
They have to negotiate. They have to talk. No one can get everything that they want. And there were efforts, when this first began, when Russia, they call it its special military operation, but very quickly began talking to Ukraine. I think it's important to talk about what led to Russia going into Ukraine. This effort going back several decades to expand NATO. All of the former Warsaw Pact nations are now members of NATO, members of the EU. And Ukraine was this last domino to fall, and that's a threat to Russia's security. So Russia had been demanding a security agreement. The US refused. There actually was an agreement, the Minsk Accords in 2015, which Western leaders like Angela Merkel admitted were all a ploy to forestall Russia and help Ukraine militarily. So there have been efforts, or shall I say, appeals to peace, to talking about what could be a different arrangement, but the US has refused. So China offered its services as a mediator, so to speak, to host talks, but the US has refused. That's the only way out of this. They have to talk to Russia. And in Switzerland, there was this recent peace conference. I'm sorry, I'm getting the term wrong for what they called it, but Russia wasn't invited. It's like, well, how do you resolve this without talking to Russia? That's just absurd. So that's what's needed. Everything can be discussed, I believe. Wars can end with negotiations. They don't have to end because there are more dead bodies on one side than on the other. So that's what's needed. But having made this decision, the US and Europe can't back off. They have cast their lot in this direction. They can't admit that it's a failure. I think especially in the US, as long as Biden is president, there's no hope for anything different, although Donald Trump isn't offering anything different. He claimed he wanted to end funding to Ukraine, which is so far more than $175 billion in the last 2 years. But then he, did a U-turn, and then suddenly he was in favor of this last allocation. So we see at the very top of support for this attempt at hegemony, which is failing. So we need a political transformation in the US. We need a political transformation in Europe. But I unfortunately don't see that happening anytime soon.
That's a very sobering point there, Margaret. But I mean, this is the key thing. This isn't going to be resolved at anything other than a negotiating table. I think that's a really important takeaway. And that kind of leads me to the next question, because you mentioned China's role in trying to broker peace in Ukraine. But the US isn't just on a war drive against Russia, it's also on a war drive against China. And I just wanted to ask you, why is the US pursuing such an aggressive path against China as well as Russia?
Well, the US doesn't want any rivals. As long as the US believes it has to be the superpower, that it has to have control all over the world. It can't accept any rival. China is an economic rival mostly. Some say the largest economy in the world. It's a manufacturing giant. They have a bigger problem with China because China has economic connections with countries all over the world and can't be easily dismissed. But once again, we see this just insane effort to try to control, to weaken Russia, to restrain China. It's ludicrous, but in the US, it's taken on this crazy dimension where China is literally blamed for everything. We're told that China's buying up farmland in the US. The biggest owner of farmland in the US is Bill Gates. Okay, China, of all the foreign entities that own agricultural properties, China's like less than 1%. It's just ridiculous. But then you have states like Florida actually passing laws saying Chinese nationals can't purchase property. It's horrible, but it's all fake. It's about TikTok, which isn't owned by China. It's a Singaporean country. Of course, now Israel wants to get rid of TikTok, so that's the new effort in the US, but it takes on these bizarre dimensions. And I was recently in China as part of a Friends of Socialist China delegation, and I learned more about China's desire to get along with the US, to talk, to cooperate. Cooperation is a key word for them. But you have a country, the US, which doesn't want to cooperate with anyone. They only want to cooperate with vassals. But that's not cooperation, then, is it? It's just subjugating other countries. So they tried to instigate Taiwan against China. And there's a recent news story that Xi Jinping said he knew the US was trying to bait China into invading Taiwan, but he wasn't going to fall for the bait. So now they're using the Philippines to try to take action against China. So these are other nuclear powers, these are military and economic powers. But this idea that the US could actually have a hot war with either country is something that is gaining credence amongst the political class in the United States. We're run by delusional people who don't see the dangers to go back to Ukraine to tell the Ukrainians they can strike in Russian territory. And now with China using Taiwan or the Philippines as, they can only end up the way Ukraine has ended up. So this is what we're faced with. There was a recent proposals in Congress to bring back a draft. We have selective service enrollment for young men. We've had it since Jimmy Carter, I believe, since the 70s. When young men turn 18, they're supposed to sign up for selective service. Everybody doesn't do it. So now they're trying to make it automatic. So they're going to comb through records and roll everybody and include young women. There's another proposal to include young women. Why do you need that? Are you really planning a hot war against nuclear nations? But apparently that answer is yes. And in a presidential election year, we actually see more bizarre proposals because these are seen as politically appealing. So we actually see more craziness rather than less in an election year.
Yeah, I have to say, it feels really like an overall consensus, this anti-China sentiment in the US.
Mhm.
But in your opinion, are there factions that are against this? Are there any voices that are coming out? And if so, how do we actually build this movement with them to stop this drive?
Well, politically, it's very dangerous that these efforts are all bipartisan. Whatever else Democrats and Republicans disagree on, they have a consensus on US imperialism, supporting US efforts to dominate the rest of the world. The voices in Congress who should be representing the people, they're very few in number, they're very timid, they're bought off, they're cowardly. And the corporate media, you see, they covered up I was talking about the Nord Stream pipeline. They covered up that story completely. The New York Times belatedly, 2 years after the fact, is now reporting on the peace talks that took place in 2022 with the peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. So we see a political class that's united. We see corporate media covering for them, and it's left to the people. We don't have the strong mass movement that we need. I'm old enough to remember Even though I was a kid, I do well remember the protests about the Vietnam War and the large mass movements. And I remember there was debate within the political class. They were called hawks and doves, but there were people in Congress who would speak out and say they opposed US policy. But that seems to be in the past. If you want information, I mean, with the internet, it's possible to get the information, but you have to do it yourself. You can't depend on the television networks or the major newspapers to tell you what's going on. So we're left to do our best. That's why we need independent journalism at Black Agenda Report and other outlets, so that people who have the wherewithal to find out for themselves, and organizations such as those I'm affiliated with, Black Alliance for Peace, United National Anti-War Coalition, to do our best to gain public attention and present a different narrative to people. But, the movement is admittedly small. It's too small to move the needle. It's too small to impact legislation or get the ear of Congress, but we don't give up. So we continue our work in optimism that we can bring about these changes.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think when we're thinking about building a movement, Margaret, the issue I think which can maybe cut through is the fact that this aggressive foreign policy is costing ordinary Americans an absolute fortune. I mean, you've mentioned already that the US has allocated 175 billion to the war effort in Ukraine. So I wondered if you could talk about the impact of the US's massive military spending and this addiction to war on US society.
Well, anything that the people need, we're told no. Any proposal that helps people, what are we told? Where is it going to come from? Who's going to pay for that? How much is that going to cost? But supporting Ukraine's economy is something that's never discussed. Money for Israel, $12 billion since last October alone. We're talking about austerity for the people, not for the military industrial complex. But for the people, the answer is always no. There's always some explanation about how the system works. And even though Biden seems to have a majority in the Senate, it's not really a majority. And the Republicans have the House, and you can't ask for anything. But if it's about war, the duopoly parties are of one mind. And they're of one mind about telling the people no. Joe Biden, his reelection is in doubt, and they marketed him as being very progressive, the most progressive president since Franklin Roosevelt, and he was going to cut child poverty in half. And there were some programs that existed during the COVID epidemic, but they've all disappeared. And I joke, people, and Biden is too old. He's not well. It seems pretty obvious to me he has some sort of cognitive issues. But I always tell people, if these programs, the child tax credit, for example, if things like that existed, people would vote for him anyway, even though they can see he had these issues. But there is consensus between the two parties, consensus for war, consensus for domination, consensus for funding the military industrial complex, and consensus for telling the people no. So the two things go together. I am one who has always said you can't separate the domestic from the international. You could, I suppose, fund the military industrial complex and help the people. But I believe the goal of the ruling class is to immiserate the people, to lower our standard of living, to keep us in a state of precarity. And what better way to do that than to use our resources for these foreign adventures and attempts at domination that, for them, kill two birds with one stone, keeps the US on top and keeps the people down. So that is their goal, to keep the people down.
You've written and spoken a lot about the links between white supremacy, racism, imperialism, and war. And I have to say, you're one of the few voices that I hear that makes these links very clearly. Black Alliance for Peace is really, I guess for me, I might be slightly ignorant, but for me, it's one of the few prominent organizations that emphasizes these connections. Can you explain a little bit more about why it's so important to center this framework?
Well, I think it's important because it explains a lot about the US and its history. The US was founded as the settler colonial state, which depended upon destroying indigenous peoples, depended upon enslaving African people. So that's the very beginning of this country. It's foundational to the US. This belief that the US has to dominate as a white nation, even though, everyone is not white, it is still perceived that way. And even when Black people are in power, they still see it that way. So, Barack Obama still saw it that way, or Colin Powell still saw it that way. I believe a lot of the animus against China is just because it's not a white country. And this idea that people who aren't white can have a bigger economy, that the US should have to deal with them as an equal partner, is something that's anathema to a lot of people. The idea that the US has this right to go to war to countries with sanctions, unilateral economic coercive measures, commonly known as sanctions, that the US can destroy Cuba's economy or Venezuela or Iran or DPRK. I could go on and on and on. That the US has this concept of manifest destiny in the 1800s, that the US was destined, was manifested by God to take the whole continent, to dominate the whole continent, to eradicate indigenous populations. And that idea of manifest destiny still predominates in this country. They don't use the term, but the idea is the same, that the US has this right to dominate other peoples and other nations, and within its nation to have some groups dominated on the bottom and to have white people on top. So I don't think it's something that can be separated from any discussions we have about how the US behaves around the world.
Absolutely. I mean, that kind of flows on to the next question in terms of, you were mentioning, the US's animosity to China as a non-white nation. And you've recently gone to China yourself, as you mentioned, as part of the Friends of Socialist China delegation. And I was wondering if you could share some experiences, because we don't really hear anything but negativity in the mainstream Western media about China. So we'll be really excited to hear, what you thought about your visit over there, Margaret.
Well, it was fast. It was a bit of a whirlwind. We had a lot of, I don't know if you've ever been on one of these delegations. It's, bilateral meeting and then a museum and then another historic site and so on and so on. But for me, there's nothing like seeing something for yourself. I knew that China has this amazing infrastructure, that airports are beautiful, the roadways are amazing, the architecture is great. And it's because it's a socialist country. And here in the US, we're always told socialism doesn't work. It doesn't work. And we're giving the example of some country that the US has, tried to destroy its socialist revolution, but China has succeeded in winning and keeping its revolution. So you see this country that has transformed itself in a very short period of time, going from being one of the poorest countries in the world to having the biggest economy in the world, to eradicating extreme poverty, lifting millions of people out of poverty. I have a new standard here in New York where I live, and in other big cities in the US. You often see people who are unhoused, who are living on the street. And one of my measures of society's civilization is, do they let people live on the street? And then I visited 3 major Chinese cities and didn't see anybody living on the street. That doesn't mean there's no one unhoused, but I think it's an indication of prioritizing the people's needs. And their idea of modernization is not just about making money for the capitalist class. And they do have a private sector. They do have rich individuals, but they aren't the ones who control the system. So you see that the needs of ordinary people are being met. I'm not going to say it's a perfect place. No place is perfect. But, here in this country, we're told that there's no other system. There's nothing else you can want. This is the best place, and it's ridiculous to think that it needs to change, or that you can or should contemplate having anything different, which is why it's so important to have those opportunities to see something different, to see how well other countries can work, especially when it's a country we're told we're not supposed to like. So it was a very interesting experience, and I do wish that there was more serious study about why China works the way it does, or what are the contradictions, or what are the limitations, or what are the problems they have, instead of this really crude war propaganda that, it's a failed country and you're supposed to hate them and they want to buy up your farmland and all manner of just crazy lies about China. But China wants to cooperate. They call it the win-win. Now they feel like an adversary, having been labeled as such, but China and Russia too, they were ready to do deals with the US, and they did, sometimes to their discredit. In 2011, if either of those countries had vetoed the no-fly zone resolution at the UN about Libya, Libya might not have been destroyed. But they were trying to placate the United States. But they don't do that anymore, which is a good thing. But instead of getting some sort of intelligent analysis about these countries, we just get this crude propaganda. But China has 18% of the world's population. And yet in the United States, it's relegated to this outsider status. And we're always told the world is against China, or Putin is isolated in the world. No, it's not. The world is not the US and Europe and Canada, although that's what we're told. So we have a huge segment of the world's population that is living a different life, whose quality of life is comparable or better. But we live in this bubble, this created bubble in this country, and we're told that, there's no outside world. Right? There was some science fiction show about people living in a bubble, and I think I get the feeling that's what they want for us, to just forget about or to be completely ignorant of any other way that a country can run. Because if we were more aware, if more Americans were more aware, we would not stand for this. We would not stand for this fake democracy where the people's needs are ignored, where the allegedly opposition parties come together to give money to Ukraine or to Israel, or to fight China instead of getting along with China.
Yeah, that leads us to our next question really well, because I actually have two questions that sort of segue in, because I used to live in the US and I often thought to myself, like, what would rock bottom look like for the US? I mean, sorry, like, in order to want to change, like you're saying, how do these cracks in the bubbles appear? Like, how do they actually? And now it just seems like we're in a place where they would be appearing, and that people might be aware that, they're not necessarily the best country in the world. So one, do you think that that's true, that there is sort of that sort of awareness sort of seeping through? And the other thing is, like, how do we actually inform these people more and maybe push them over the ledge a little bit, like onto our side? That was a terrible metaphor, but yeah.
Well, I think I know what you mean, but we're starting to see the cracks with the protests against US policy towards Israel and US support of Israel's genocide and war crimes. And by the way, the terms genocide and war crimes are defined. It's not a matter of opinion. Genocide, there's a UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, I believe from 1948, which defines genocide broadly as an intent to harm a group of people, a racial, ethnic, or national group. And then it gives example of what kind that harm can be. The harm doesn't have to just be killing. It can be violence. It can be mental harm. And war crimes, the Fourth Geneva Convention's Article 33 says, for example, collective punishment is by definition a war crime. So when Israel says they have to kill thousands of people to fight Hamas, they are in fact confessing to war crime. And this is something that cannot be hidden from the people. And these massive protests we've seen against Israel are an indication of a crack that you refer to in the system, but they quickly try to plaster over the crack and to subjugate the people who are speaking out. So you see people being silenced. In this particular case, they silence people by labeling any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism. So if you question our money going to kill people if you don't want to kill them, or the fact that the Israel lobby is such a powerful political force, Congress, in fact, and this was bipartisan, they invited Prime Minister Netanyahu to speak before Congress. So we see when the crack can appear, but they quickly, if they can't do anything else, they just use brute force to silence everyone. Anyone who makes, even asking a question about Israel or US policy about Israel, people are shunned and they are disappeared from public life. So we had a member of Congress who was censured. It's an official condemnation of a member of Congress because she used the term "from the river to the sea," Rashida Tlaib. And now we're told that this phrase is inherently anti-Semitic. People are losing jobs, being expelled from school. We saw college campuses, which is, not a surprise, become a center of protest, but these were crushed by the police. Here in New York, where I live, at Columbia University, in the City University system, in California, at the University of California, Los Angeles, we saw the police working with a mob, a Zionist mob, to physically attack protesters, to be told Jewish students weren't allowed to go into their classrooms. It was propaganda, lies, brute force, people being denied opportunities or losing their jobs. So yes, we see the cracks, but we see the response to when the cracks start to appear. It's the way the US treats the rest of the world, that the US has to dominate. So this narrative has to dominate. And any sign that indicates the lack of legitimacy, the legitimacy that the state has lost in this instance and in others, has to be smashed. So that's what we see when the cracks are there. I think one of the reasons is it could spread. People might question this, then who knows? They could start questioning other things. This need to demonize the people who are speaking up. And we're told, for example, at Columbia University here, these are elitist kids and no one should listen to them. But the interesting thing to me is, first of all, it's not true of every student there, but even if it is, let's say you're in the quote unquote elite in one country, you still identify with people in a faraway country who are suffering. That's commendable. Isn't that commendable for people to make a connection with humanity in some other place? But they don't want that. They don't want you to feel connected to other people. So if you feel connected to Palestine, you might feel connected with the unhoused. You might feel connected with people in the mass incarceration system. You might feel connected to the unemployed. So I believe it's not just because of the power of the Israel lobby. They want to crush dissent. They want to make sure that people shut up and go along. And anything that puts the system in crisis, they see as a danger. And that's why it's attacked.
So what would you recommend that people listen, watch, or, to sort of get to strengthen that awareness?
Well, I will, toot my own horn and say read blackagendareport.com. We have a new issue every Wednesday, and a couple days later, we have our podcast, Black Agenda Radio. But Black Alliance for Peace we're an anti-imperialist organization. It's a membership organization. People who are not of African ancestry. There's a solidarity network. There's also good journalism. Consortium News is a good news source. I'm on all social media, Twitter and Facebook. So the International Manifesto Group is a good source of information. Orinoco Tribune, MR Online, Africa Stream is a great online resource. So I think once you start looking for these, you'll, the way the internet works now, you'll find the others. Electronic Intifada, if you want to know about Palestine. Pan-African Newswire, they encyclopedic knowledge about the African continent. And we follow all of these sources on Black Agenda Report. But for as long as we can, social media is problematic because they can censor you. You can find out information, but then they can censor you, or, you can be shadow banned. And these things can and do happen. They've happened to people who I know, who I work with. But I say we use these platforms for as long as we can. Facebook actually is fairly useless. I can post my own interviews or something, but as far as sharing information politically, I mean, it works with the Atlantic Council. I mean, they tell you so. The Atlantic Council is NATO, by the way. Twitter, you have a better chance. Black Power Media on YouTube. How could I forget? Use the platforms as much as you can. I love Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey, I can't remember the name of his YouTube channel. Jeffrey Sachs of fans. He's a Columbia professor, a person who had access to the very top of the political class, who's now politically, he's sounding the alarm about the dangers these people present. He's endorsed Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate for president. So he's a good person to watch on YouTube. So those are just off the top of my head some of the sources that folks can look at, but we have to use these platforms as much as we can, familiarize ourselves as much as we can, so that we can be knowledgeable. And when they tell you the Biden administration says Israel has a peace plan, and then you're like, no, they don't. And even the Israelis say, well, no, we haven't signed on to this plan. The goal is to shut you up. So let's just make up things to fill in those holes in the cracks that we were just talking about. But those are some of the places where you can get good information.
Oh, brilliant. I mean, we've definitely got the odds stacked against us, but if you look at what's happened on Palestine, actually social media and people putting out testimony from Gaza and the anti-war movement speaking out has actually defeated the narrative of the mainstream media. So that does show the power, even though it's stacked against us, that getting the truth out can have. And I think it's so brilliant to hear about all of those resources, Margaret. So I hope everyone is taking notes at home as they're listening to this. And just what a fantastic way to start the Global Majority for Peace podcast. We're really, really honoured that you accepted our invitation to join us today, Margaret. And it's been such a wonderful conversation. I hope we can get you back again in the future as well.
I would love to. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you both for this effort. This is the kind of thing we need. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. And before we go, just wanted to remind everyone to like and subscribe down below, leave a comment. And also, if you're listening on audio platforms, do subscribe there as well. And if you appreciate this work and want to see us expand this global conversation, then do support our work on Patreon as well. It's Empire Watch. And over to you, Ileana. Is there anything else you want to say before we
No,
go?
I think you covered it all. And I just want to say thank you again to Margaret. And it was a very exciting episode, I think. So thank you, everyone. And see you in 2 weeks or sooner.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Okay.
Peace.
Bye. Peace.
Bye.